Some alleys have names, some don't. This one didn't. It was nothing more than a forgotten carve in the city's edge, tucked between a bakery that hadn't sold bread since last winter and a hardware store with a door that rang out of tune. And in the center of it all stood a rusting iron fence with a top bar like a crooked smile. And a cat. Every morning, without fail, she'd leap from the cracked brick windowsill onto the fence, her silver gray coat catching the first light like morning frost, and then she would sit. Still. Silent. Waiting. She refused food. Turned away from toys. Never purred when children passed or flinched at the roar of trucks. She only watched, eyes fixed beyond the rusted spikes, toward the cranes, looming, lurching, yellow-jawed monsters that swung steel like swords. Wires coiled like serpents. Beams creaked like trees in old forests. These weren't the sort of things cats usually stare at, but she watched them intently. Respectfully. As though she understood a secret nobody else did, the workers began calling her inspector. Not in jest. Not really, she was there before they arrived. Stayed after they left. She didn't blink when sparks flew, she flinched only once, when the wind carried the sound of cracking stone. No one remembered when she first appeared, only that she seemed placed, like a statue with breath, like a warning glued to the skyline. Paul, the electrician, said he'd seen cats stare at birds, mice, squirrels, but never cranes, not like this, not with this kind of knowing. Once, Gus from the plaster team joked, "Bet she's seen something we haven't." The next morning, his ladder split clean in half. She didn't meow, not once, not until much, much later. For now, she watched, and the cranes kept moving, like they knew they were being watched. It happened before the walls went up, before any slogans got painted on hard hats or coffee cups burned their rings into the site trailer desks. It happened before Paul had ever met Agnes. It happened on a morning that couldn't decide what season. It belonged to April, but somehow frosted at the edges. Gray light pressed into every surface like a faded watercolor. And from beneath a pallet of bricks, something mewed. They'd stacked the pallets near the old rubble line, never thinking much of it, just debris to be cleared in time. But today, someone heard it. Small. Thin. A cry, not of panic, but of being overlooked. Gus was the first to crouch down. "Probably a rat," he muttered. But still, he knelt. Pulled gloves tighter. Shifted one brick after another, then he saw fur. A smudge of gray. Not the gray of rats or dust, but softer, layered in lavender, like fog brushing lilacs. And eyes, impossibly large, blinking once in the cold. She stared at him as if he'd interrupted something important. The kitten didn't run. Didn't hiss. Or scream or arch. She didn't even shiver, though everything else around them did. Gus lifted her with both hands, awkwardly gentle, placing her into his own coat like a secret. She smelled of ash and old wood. At first, no one knew what to do. She was too young to be on her own. Too clean to be wild. Too quiet to scream for help. They passed her from worker to worker like a burden they couldn't name. When Paul crouched to take her, she looked up at him with something dangerously close to boredom, or maybe forgiveness. He didn't speak. Just nodded, as if in reply to a question she hadn't asked. "Just for the night," he muttered, stuffing her gently into the hood of his coat. "Till you get warm." He took her home, every step deliberate, as though afraid of waking whatever spell had led her there in the first place. His apartment was barely more than walls and wires, but he had one heater that worked, a blanket that still remembered how to smell like someone, and tea that tasted like habits. She slept that night curled in his sock drawer, tiny ribs moving like notes on a sheet of music. When he woke the next morning, she was on the windowsill, not watching him, but the outside. Still. Poised. Like she already knew the city. He called her Agnes. Not because he meant to humanize her, but because it felt like unlocking something old inside his mouth. Agnes. The name of his mother's favorite painter. The one who saw ghosts in color. He never found himself calling her anything else. Days passed. Then weeks. She grew, but not by much. Somewhere between permanent kitten and small ghost. She shadowed Paul like a second pair of boots. Grew fond. Not of toys, but of rhythms, coffee pot sputters, the buzz of fluorescent lights, the sound of rain drumming out tempo on metal piping. But every day from then on, just before dawn cracked the sky open like an egg, she'd press 2 paws to the windowsill, always east, always toward the old lot full of cranes. Agnes understood the shape of time before Paul set his shoes by the radiator. Before the kettle clicked and sighed into steam. Before the sun had fully committed to emerging behind the power lines, she was gone. A tap at the window. A soft chirp. The only warning he got, she would slip from the sill, trace a silent path out the door left cracked for her, and vanish into the slow brightening morning, as if summoned by something older than alarm clocks or breakfast bells. Paul tried to follow. At first, curious, maybe. Or just lonely, but she moved like fog, not feline, blending into rusted rails and fence shadow. By the time he reached the curb, she was already on her perch, poised in velvet silence, tail coiled, gaze steady, always watching, always the cranes. They weren't new, not anymore. The site where she'd been found was now a symphony of rising steel and ordered chaos. Hammers striking with hive-mind rhythm. Engines backfiring. Radios crackling with static and half-sung verses of old country songs, and yet, amid all that aimless noise, Agnes sat in ceremony. She didn't blink at sparks or startle at shouting. Once, a slab of concrete dropped with such thunder it startled 2 pigeons into collision, but Agnes only twitched an ear. By now, the workers had grown used to her ritual. Ray, the foreman with hands like bricks and a voice like gravel, swore she knew who was late before even he did. "She looks at you different," he'd mutter, nodding toward the fence when someone strolled in 2 minutes past call time. Gus, still sheepish about the day he discovered her, kept a thermos cap filled with milk beside his toolbox. She never drank it. He never seemed surprised. They started placing small things near her perch. Not offerings, just gestures. A twisted nail shaped like a fish. A strip of plaid fabric from someone's flannel. A marble. A key with no door. None of it moved. She wasn't there for gifts. Every day at 7:03, she arrived. Rain stitched the horizon. She came. Sky spilled sun like honey over the unfinished windows. She came. Wind howled so hard the workers tied down their helmets. She came, and she watched, as if the cranes could fall if her eyes left them. As if she remembered what it felt like to be buried and waited for someone else to listen. One evening, Paul tried to coax her back early. She ignored him. Not with anger, but finality, like a page turned. Like a decision made before ink touched parchment. So he waited. He brought a folding chair to the alley and waited beside her. That night, they watched the welders hiss purple fire into the skin of the new frame. Lit silhouettes flickered across. Steel like ghost stories told in sparks. Paul didn't speak, but Agnes, in the hush between clatters, blinked, then blinked again, and the cranes kept moving. Most of the workers didn't believe in signs. They believed in torque settings, shift whistles, time cards, and rust. But over time, even the most skeptical ones looked up when Agnes arrived. Ray would watch her from the corner of his eye, pretending to squint at the sun, and mutter. Little inspectors clocked in. It was always the same. 7:03 a.m. Not a minute early. Not a breath late, like she was stitched into the schedule. They joked about it in the trailer, scrawling her name on the safety board beneath attendance. Agnes, present. Sometimes, someone added a tiny paw print beside IT. IT started small. A few extra glances. An offhand comment or two. But slowly, the quiet reverence grew. No one asked her to be there. Yet, nobody wanted to imagine a day without her. She didn't fetch string or chase bottle caps. When the guys tossed bits of sandwich or chicken her way, she'd sniff, maybe blink, but never eat. One afternoon, a whole sausage roll sat untouched on the fence post until it went stale. Sparrows picked at it later. Agnes didn't move. There were theories. Maybe she smelled something in the machinery. Maybe she liked the vibration of the concrete mixers that buzzed through the soil. Maybe she had once lived here, beneath the rubble, under rebar and ash, and this place was familiar, but none of them ever said that theory out loud. It felt like trespassing. Once, a new hire, young, brash, didn't know better, tried to sweat her off the fence with the end of his measuring tape. "Scares off the pigeons," he said before flicking it her way. She held her ground, eyes narrowed, as though measuring his soul. Later that morning, the young man slipped while moving a sheet of plywood. Nothing serious, just a bruised ankle, but no one said, "I told you so." They never had to. After that, even he greeted her, gentle and a step slower than before. Mirth met ritual. Lunch breaks stretched longer near her post. Coffee steam curled toward her silhouette like incense. Apprentices came with quiet questions. She answered none of them, but they came anyway. They started calling her different things now. Lady Agnes. The Watcher. A few even claimed she changed colors. In certain light, looked more silver one day, more blue the next. Like fog deciding what shade of sky to wear. Nobody noticed how quickly her presence became needed, until the day she didn't come. It was November. The air held that edge, cold enough to sting, not yet enough to snow. And when the bell rang, no soft weight settled on the crooked fence post. No silence that bent around her stillness. No eyes at the edge of the sky. A few glanced up. Ray checked his watch. Paul, on site that morning for a service call, stood by the alley a beat too long. But the work had to begin. Mid-morning, something happened. The site's elevator cable snapped during a load test. No one inside. No injuries. But the sound cut through steel and bone, like a scream underwater. For hours, the rhythm of the build fell out of sync. Tools missed beats. Nails went in crooked. Silence lingered longer between shifts. When the sun rose the next day, Agnes was back, seated, still. Watching, she didn't acknowledge anyone. Didn't blink, but Ray looked at her and nodded like she was a colleague. "Guess we can work now," he said. Everyone laughed, a little too quickly. No one asked where she had gone. No one ever would. Some just whispered, "Maybe she only leaves to remind us what still hurts." The wind that morning tugged at sleeves and carried the kind of chill that crept under doorframes. Smoke from the bakery's chimney spiraled oddly, sideways, curling in on itself like it had forgotten which way to go. The fence post, damp with frost, was empty. Ray arrived first. He didn't say anything. Just looked once, long enough for the cold to settle deeper. Then he went about unlocking the trailer, flicking on lights that buzzed half-heartedly in protest. By 7:10, people had started to murmur. 10 minutes wasn't long, not in crane time, not in truck time, but it felt unnatural. Like the rhythm was offbeat. Someone checked the clock, as if it had lied. The sky was a graying bruise above the rising structure, cloud-heavy and silent. Paul happened to be on site again, new conduit install, wall B2. He walked slower that day, half hoping she'd sweep by his ankles or appear on the corner like a ghost shaped from soot, but there was nothing. The absence was too loud. Inside the site trailer, Gus scribbled on the dry erase board. Beneath Agnes, present, he added a hesitant line, then wiped it off. No one spoke about it. By 9 a.m., the crew started settling into the new rhythm, not out of comfort, but necessity. Tools hummed, coffee cooled, and the mechanical ballet resumed. They fastened harnesses, locked scaffolds, yelled over static-laced radios. At 10:26 a.m., the safety line on the elevator trembled. The IT wasn't part of routine testing. Just noise, at first, a click louder than usual, a hitch in the pulleys. Breathing. Then it snapped. Loud. Sharp. Final. Like the world had caught its breath and bitten down, the elevator cage dropped just half a floor, no one inside. Locked open and braced, thank God. Still, the steel slammed hard enough that the frame shuddered and an entire stack of drywall panels tilted over with a crack. No one spoke for a long while. Eventually, Ray muttered, "That's a sign," and walked off without clarifying what kind. The rest of the day dragged with shoes full of gravel and glances pulled upward. Every creak made people jumpy. No stories were told at lunch. And Paul didn't finish his tea, which almost never happened. The next morning, frost etched feathered patterns on the trailer windows. Cold still lingered, but so did something warmer. She was there. Agnes sat on the crooked fence as if she had never left. Not a hair out of place. Eyes narrowed. Tail curved like a question. In her stillness, she seemed even more certain, like something had ended, and she had returned at its closing. Ray stopped at the edge of the alley. Looked at her. Nodded slow. "Guess we can work now," he said. It was meant to be a joke. The way he said it made people laugh. But every single laugh came with a glance in her direction. She didn't blink, she didn't move, but the rhythm, the one they couldn't name, softly slid back into place. Paul stayed longer after his job was done. Just a few minutes more, leaning near the alley mouth, coffee cooling against his palms. He didn't try to touch her. Or speak. Just let the moment settle. Behind them, cranes resumed their sweeping arcs. Steel met sky. Dust danced in the sun like forgotten letters tossed in the air, and she watched. Winter began not with snow, but with sound. The scaffolding changed pitch when walked upon, a deeper clang that echoed further than it had before. The walls that once whispered now sang in gusts. Even the drills sounded different, more brittle. Like they were burrowing into frozen steel rather than fastening it. Agnes remained, through every shift in season, without fail. She kept her post. Snow powdered her ears. Rain steamed from her back. Autumn leaves tangled in her tail, but still she sat. Same place. Same time. 7:03.1 morning. Snow blanketed the site so suddenly the crew had to carve paths through white silence. Ray arrived early to salt the stairs, only to find a clear circle on the fence post. No snow on it. No tracks leading to it. But Agnes was there, tail tucked, eyes reflecting the pale blue morning. Gus began leaving a folded bit of flannel for her on colder days. She never sat on it but never moved it either. Like she acknowledged it without accepting it. As if the sentiment had value beyond touch, the building itself had begun to take shape, real walls, real floors. You could walk through corridors and imagine offices or meeting spaces. There were jokes about who would get which corner. Ray teased Paul that he'd make a good janitor for the finished tower, and Agnes watched through it all. Once, during a quiet lunch, a storm moved in too fast. Wind howled down the alley, tugged on jackets like impatient children. Thunder cracked, almost theatrical. Most of the crew ran for cover, but Agnes didn't move. A few watched her from the trailer door, silhouetted by stormlight, still as a statue, staring into the jagged sky like she'd seen worse and would see worse again. They started pointing her out to new hires. "That's Lady Agnes," they'd say. "She's management." Everyone laughed, but less so as weeks went on and the building kept thriving without injury, without collapse, without loss, just bruises, broken sockets, one sprained wrist, and the elevator that one day, inside Paul's apartment, her presence was smaller now. Just a sleeping indent on his armchair. But every morning, she returned to the site with resolve as sure as gravity. He began to wonder, was it fidelity? Memory? A vow made in feline silence? Sometimes he asked her out loud. She would yawn or blink or walk away. Once, she placed a paw on his knee before a winter storm, held it there longer than usual, then left. She didn't return until the thaw broke, 3 days later, eyes glinting like moonlight caught in puddles. Paul didn't ask where she'd gone. He just made tea and left the door open. When spring came, the fence post groaned with the heat, but there she was. Pigeons came back, fluttering in ridiculous arcs above the cranes. Workers peeled off jackets, sleeves rolled. Tulips bloomed between the cracks in the concrete like memories no one planted, and still, Agnes sat. Like the building was growing not from blueprints, not from welds, but from her trust in it.as, though every floor added had first passed beneath her trembling whiskers.as. Though she remembered a time when she was buried beneath rubble and now carried the shape of safety in her gaze. Perhaps she knew what buildings became when no one loved them. She never purred, but Paul swore that sometimes, especially in the quiet between hammer falls, he heard a sound like stone settling. Like breath being held. Like watching. Resurrect something without saying its name, and every day, the sight rose higher, and Agnes watched it climb. Paul wasn't used to silence. His job hummed with low voltage, tools talked in whines and whirs, wires whispered secrets behind drywall. Even home had its cadence, kettle sighs, radiator clicks, his own awkward slippers against tile, but without Agnes during the day, things felt unlayered.at first, it didn't bother him. Cats come and go. That's the nature of them, but every morning like clockwork, she chirped once at the door. And by the time he looked up from his cereal, she was already crossing the street, shadow tethered to her heels like a second tail. She never turned around, she never needed to. Paul started leaving the door open a little longer.at work, when routes happened to bring him near the site, he felt himself slowing, meandering past the crooked fence. And there she was. Always in place. Always impossible to ignore. Sometimes she sat beside someone's discarded glove or a half-eaten sandwich wrapped too neatly to be trash. Sometimes she was nestled near a boot no one claimed. He caught her once letting a new apprentice scratch gently beneath her chin. Another time, she lay curled like a question mark beside Ray's thermos. She was present, but distant. Like rain. That doesn't soak through, only miss skin.at. Some point, Paul stopped trying to understand. He brought his coffee to the alley on weekends when he wasn't on shift. Folded himself into a chair beside the fence, knees cracked just from bending. Agnes didn't acknowledge him. Not directly. But once, just once, her tail tapped twice against his boot. A tiny percussion of something nearly lost. He took to chatting softly, more for himself than her. Half thoughts. Weather notes. Odd dreams. She didn't listen, not really. But she didn't leave either. That silence, that not leaving, said more than agreement ever could. He began to notice how she moved differently around the site, not randomly, but intentionally. Drifted towards where pipes groaned weird, lingered where sparks were hesitant. Sat longer some days on corners being reinforced, shorter on days with no concrete pour. The workers said she'd taken on shifts like all of them, arrived with purpose, left trailing dust. She's like a priest, Gus told Paul once, not entirely joking. Blessing the beams before they're baptized in drywall. Paul smiled but didn't respond. He didn't tell Gus that Agnes had started sleeping a little lighter at home. That she sometimes woke in the middle of the night and paced the living room, eyes aimed at something he couldn't see. He didn't say that some nights, she curled against the window not in comfort, but in vigil, and he definitely didn't mention what happened one evening when he was walking home, and a scrap of insulation from the site whipped across the avenue like a whisper. Agnes stood in the alley, still as stone, and in that moment, he realized, she didn't belong to him, not anymore. Maybe not ever. She belonged to the cranes.to, the steel.to, the workers who never said it, but always made space. She was the breath between their footsteps. The pause between poured concrete and the set. The hush before a weld sealed true. Paul stopped waiting for her to greet him after work. Instead, he turned on the porch light. Steeped tea. Left a blanket on the chair she curled into when she returned. Scent of dust in her fur. He didn't need to follow her anymore, but some nights, after the news played low and the world dulled at its edges, he stood at the window, watching not the city, but her absence, and feeling, without quite knowing why, that She was more present now than ever. There's a kind of silence that feels louder than noise. It came on a Wednesday, sky bruised with clouds, air sharp with a warning that no one could name. The kind of morning that felt too still, not peaceful, but paused. Agnes didn't go straight to her post. Instead, she lingered on the corner, head tilted, eyes scanning the half-shaped steel like she was reading a blueprint only she could see. Her tail didn't move. Her whiskers trembled in some wind too quiet to feel. Paul was already watching from the window. He didn't say her name. He knew better now. But when she veered left instead of right, toward the stairwell under construction, he moved quickly. Shoes half-laced, jacket over pajamas, thermos forgotten on the table. Across the street, something was wrong. Agnes circled a low corner of the site, near the hollow elevator shaft, still waiting for wiring, still open like a wound. She sat. Meowed, not loudly, not theatrically, but sound, where none had belonged. Ray heard it first from the scaffolding. A strange cry. He followed it, down 2 flights, across a narrow walkway slick with last night's rain, toward the voice that didn't belong in the chaos of drills and cutter blades. He found her there, seated beside the gap where the stairwell met the shaft, looking down. By the time Gus reached them, white-faced and silent, she was meowing again. This time sharper. Not asking. Demanding. Ray leaned in. At the base of the shaft, a shape. A hard hat. An arm. Movement, barely. They called it in. EMTs arrived fast. The man, a young subcontractor only added to the site 2 weeks ago, had slipped on frost from a misaligned drainage pipe. He'd fallen into the gap no wider than a man's shoulder. Broken collarbone. Light concussion. Had been unconscious all night. They said 20 more minutes, and it might have been worse. Someone asked how they'd found him. Ray didn't answer. He only turned to Paul, who stood just beyond the caution tape, hands in his pockets, watching. Agnes, as if she'd grown 2 shadows, she told us, he said, and no one laughed. Agnes left after the EMTs pulled away. Slipped beneath the nearest fencing, tail ghosting behind her like chalk across a blackboard. That evening, Paul didn't try to coax her in. He waited until sundown, then left the back door open a crack. She entered just past midnight, damp and flecked with drywall dust. Went straight to the window. Saturday didn't sleep. Didn't eat, just watched. Outside, the cranes were still, and above them, a single blinking tower light pulsed against the night sky. Slow, steady, like a breath, like a heartbeat, like thanks whispered in the only language she used. Some stories travel faster than email. By the time the next batch of apprentices arrived, wide-eyed and shrug-shouldered, the legend was already waiting for them, couched in coffee steam and the scent of rust. No one handed it out in pamphlets. It wasn't part of safety orientation. But by their 3rd lunch break, they'd heard she only meows when it matters. If she blinks twice, check your harness. She walked past me once, and 10 minutes later, I realized I'd left a tape measure in a live panel. Swear to God. They chuckled when they said it, sure. But nobody looked amused when they spoke her name. Agnes. It was spoken with the same tone people reserved for steam pressure and fault lines. Not fear, just respect. Like the way one knows not to whistle in tunnels or joke on ladders, there was a comfort in the myth. A quiet logic. Buildings rise because of hands, yes, but also because of rituals that can't be put on blueprints. And Agnes had become one. They told each other stories with straight faces and hands cupped around thermoses. She jumped down from the fence the day the scaffolding shifted. Almost like she heard it just before it happened. She won't look at you if you haven't snapped your vest buckle. She followed Ray around the whole morning. We poured the southwest footing. He said it felt like penance. And more than one person claimed she didn't age. She was full-grown when my cousin worked here. And that was 4 years ago. Could be a different cat. Then tell me why she has the same nick in her left ear. Exactly the same. They passed around a photo once, old, grainy, taken the year the ground was first broken on the lot. A cat on a crooked fence post, tail curled, eyes fixed. You couldn't see the color, but everyone said it felt silver. The apprentices started watching her without meaning to, measuring their own movements against her stillness. Adjusting angles just slightly when they caught her glance lingering too long. Nobody said, she told me to. But they listened all the same. One even admitted she helped him find something. My wallet, he said, half laughing. I swear, she tapped the toolbox lid with her paw. I pop it open, there it is. Thought. I left it at home. Everyone smiled. Paused. Let the idea settle. Maybe she was lucky, maybe she was magic, maybe she was just watching closely enough to know the things they forgot, but even that explanation didn't fit entirely. Agnes didn't seem to want anything. Not food. Not touch. Not praise. She didn't purr, but when the wind shifted and the sun caught the glass of the rising tower just right, some of them swore she shimmered as though she was made of something thinner than fur. As though looking at her too long made the world reorder itself, subtle, incomprehensible, permanent. One apprentice, barely 20, always talked too fast. One said it flat out, maybe she's not a cat. The group went quiet, stomachs full of sandwiches, hands dusty with drywall grit. Then Ray coughed, tossed a crust to a pigeon, and stood to leave. She is, he said, then softer, almost like it wasn't meant for anyone, she just doesn't stop being. No one replied. They went back to work, and outside, perched silent and silver against the humming frame of the city, Agnes watched as she always had, as she always would. Spring arrived without drama. No dramatic thaw, no symbolic bloom. Just quieter mornings, warmer wind threading through scaffolding, and the smell of wet concrete instead of frost. The world tipped slightly forward, and flowers answered without asking why. On a Tuesday, the last beam when it slid into place with the slow grace of something sacred, guided by cables, steady hands, and breath held across the site like a prayer. Someone clapped. Then another. Someone else whooped. When the crane operator leaned out of the cabin and shouted, "She's struttin', boys," even Ray grinned. The tower was done, not finished in detail, no desks or certificates on the walls. But its bones stood upright, honest. A new dot on the skyline of the city no one could ever quite name, and Agnes wasn't there to. It took them hours to notice. Celebrations moved in muted circles, coffee not quite raised, but held higher. Laughter that stumbled at the edges of sentences. They looked toward the fence post between tasks, even when they didn't mean to. No twitching tail. No silver blur. No witness. By dusk, the emptiness had gathered weight. Paul came down just to see for himself. No reason. No errand. He wore the wrong kind of jacket and forgot his gloves. He scanned the alley, the window ledges, the steel perimeter where shadow met shadow, nothing. He crouched, once, by the post. Ran his hand across the old rust like he could coax loose a memory. But the iron was cold, and the air didn't hold stories. That night, workers headed home slower. Backs straighter, but eyes drawn downward. Some joked about her getting promoted. Ray mumbled something about her not wanting to hang around for the HR paperwork. His laugh never fully landed. By Wednesday, inquiries sharpened. Did anyone see her yesterday? Was it normal for her to vanish? Did she ever do this before? Paul stopped by shelters, though he didn't say whose photo he carried. He walked alleys. Distracted, hands stuffed deep in familiar pockets. He left out water and chicken in silence. For a moment, he wondered, not if she'd run away, but if she'd simply finished. No one put it in words, but everyone left something behind, on the fence post, or near her usual path. A pencil. Half of a measuring tape with its numbers worn down. A screw wrapped in ribbon, tokens, if not offerings. 7 days passed. On the 8th day, Gus arrived early. Found someone had sobbed in the frost. 2 paw prints, smudged and purposeful, pressed into the dew along the finished tiles of the lobby. They faded before anyone else saw them. Paul still walked by in the mornings, coffee in hand. Sometimes he paused, waited. Other times, he barely slowed, but the fence remained empty. Even so, Ray began signing her name again on the safety board. Agnes, present. No one erased it, they just left it there. Until the next frost. Until the next whisper. Until absence felt less like forgetting, and more like a story that knew how to wait in silence. And still, the cranes moved. The first week passed like a breath someone forgot to exhale. It wasn't that they didn't talk about it, it's just that they didn't talk about it at the same time. The workers mentioned her absence like a missing glove, casual, offhand. She really gone? Maybe she's just resting. Bet she's watching from a rooftop now, judging us from above. Nobody said the word left. Paul still looked. He didn't carry a photo anymore. He didn't knock on gates or peek beneath cars. But every morning, without fail, he walked the slim path leading past the finished building, coffee cup warmed not for drinking, but for holding. He traced the lines of glass and shadow with his eyes, as if expecting her to be curled between windowsills or behind the heating vents of the loading dock. Nothing, but sometimes, something. Once, near the service entrance, he swore he heard it, a single thrum, low and vibrating, like the tail end of a purr, buried beneath the hum of generators. Another time, faint paw prints led from one side of the workers' bench to the base of a steel column. Barely there. Just due disruption. Gone by noon. No one else mentioned seeing them. Ray claimed nothing. But Paul caught him once, walking slower near the fence, holding a sandwich in his hand, untouched, setting a small piece of ham aside near the spot where Agnes once sat. He didn't wait, just left it. Like an old habit refuses to die even when it's outgrown its ghost. And Gus, he took to carrying 2 thermos caps again. Poured milk in one. Even though they both knew it would spoil, they didn't say hope. Hope was too deliberate. This was something softer. Like waiting for a song that might come on the radio. If you just keep driving long enough. The new building had its own rhythm now. Doors opened. Desks scraped across tile. Meetings happened in offices where pigeons used to nest. A receptionist swore she heard scratches in the walls, like mice, but heavier. They sent maintenance. Found nothing. Some evenings, just as the western sun bled gold across glass, security guards swore lights flickered in the same pattern, 3 soft pulses. A pause, then stillness. Always at 7:03. Most dismissed it. Faulty wiring. Paul didn't argue. He just gripped his coffee tighter. Some nights he stood on his porch longer than he should have, eyes fixed not on the building, but the in-between places, gutters and lampposts, clotheslines and corners, anywhere a cat-shaped shadow might fold itself into something close to memory. He left the porch light on. No one asked why. The city moved on, gears still turning. Trucks still roared. Cranes still stretched their steel limbs toward cloud-filtered sun, and the fence remained empty. But on the 30th morning, just as the clock in Paul's kitchen blinked 7:02, a sound scratched at the door. Light. Careful. Certain. He opened it, and she was there, thinner, damp around the haunches. Patches of fur dusted with something gray, ash, maybe, or chalk, or just the shadow of wherever she'd been. She didn't wait for permission. Limped once through the doorway. Brushed against Paul's leg like the past brushing up against the present, then curled by the heater. Sleep found her immediately. He said nothing, just knelt near her, brushing stray particles from her back, fingers trembling not from age, but relief. A quiet kind, the sort that doesn't shatter but settles. That night, just after supper, she sat by the window, meowed once. Then again, then a third time, each one softer than the last. She stared out at the building, lights blinking faintly in its upper floors. Watched long enough for the sky to shift from navy to black, then, without drama or fanfare, she turned, walked to the armchair, paused, and curled in. She didn't return the next morning, not to the fence, not to the stairs, not to the glassy monument. Across the way, and none of the workers expected her to. When Ray passed by the alley on his way to a new site weeks later, he paused only once. Took off his hat. Scratched his forehead. Then nodded, to no one in particular. A small, quiet gesture. The kind not meant to be observed. After that night, Paul never opened the door at 7:03 again. He didn't leave chicken out. Didn't check the streetlight shadows. He just made tea, waited for the radiator to groan, and let Agnes sleep. He understood now. Whatever she'd been waiting for had arrived, and whatever had watched her while she watched the cranes had blinked. It began with dust, not the kind that clings to boots or coats your windowsills, but a hush. It hung in the air like a faded breath, stirred only by light and memory. Paul found her before the sun did, curled on the welcome mat like a question. Answered softly. She was smaller somehow, or maybe the space around her had simply grown. Her fur, once silver and moon-toned, was duller now, carrying the color of sidewalks and sleep. He didn't speak. Didn't reach for her, just opened the door. She walked in without fanfare, as if she hadn't ever left. As if this had only been a moment, a blink in something longer than time. The radiator clicked on as she crossed the room, and she folded beneath it, breath shallow but steady. Heat wrapped her like a memory. That night, she rose once. Sat at the window. The sky beyond was milked with dusk, windows of the new building blinking back in slow rhythm. She meowed, once, twice, 3 times, soft. Incomplete. Like punctuation at the end of a thought that never needed words. Paul didn't respond. He just watched. Her tail flicked against the windowsill once. Then she stepped down, padded slowly to the living room, and curled into the armchair without sound. She didn't look back, and the next morning, her place on the fence remained empty. The fence didn't sag without her. The cranes didn't moan, and the beams didn't bend. But the space, it remembered. At the site, Ray paused at the safety board. The pawprint drawn in dry erase marker still lingered. He raised the eraser, then stopped. Left it. He didn't come in at 7:03 the next day. No one asked why. Paul, now used to mornings again, noticed small changes. Agnes no longer paced at dawn. No longer chirped by the door. She slept, in real sleep, unburdened. Breathing slow. Whiskers at peace. Sometimes she joined him on the couch when the news was too loud or the rain too quick. Other times, she stayed curled in the same shape for hours, like dust learning to love the corner it settled in now and then. She'd blink awake, look toward the window. But she never pressed her paws to it. Never tried to leave. Across the street, the building glowed like it didn't remember her, but Paul knew better. He passed it on grocery walks and doctor errands. Each time, that rhythm tugged at him. Light patterns that reminded him of her tail. A soft flicker in the north stairwell, every evening at exactly 7:03, like the heartbeat of something unseen. A few of the workers still nodded at the fence. Even if it was just a habit. Gus cut back his thermos milk to a single cap, poured it in silence, left it near a new post on a different site. But Agnes? Agnes stayed. She watched from the inside now. She wrapped herself in ordinary things, wool blankets, the edge of Paul's lap, the sun that played on the kitchen tile, and though her eyes were still glass clear and sharp, she no longer carried that weight, whatever had pulled her across that street for all those days. Through storms and dust and the hush of construction, was finished. She'd seen it through. The cranes continued their ballet, but their watcher had stepped down from her post, not out of weariness, but choice. She had nothing more to guard. Paul never tried to capture the moment it changed. He knew it wasn't a moment at all, but a slow dissolving, like sugar in tea. And late at night, when the city sighed through open windows, he'd sometimes glance over. There she'd be, tucked into the corner of the couch, asleep, still, present. Some mornings, Agnes didn't wake until the third kettle whistle. She blinked, not slowly, not urgently, just the way someone might if they were scrolling through a dream and paused to reread a line. Then, she'd stretch. A long, deliberate ripple from paw tip to spine, tail curling in a perfect arc before folding neatly beside her again. Paul always smiled when he caught it. Like the cat had remembered gravity just long enough to rearrange herself around it, she no longer raced to the door, no longer chirped preamble on her way out. That chapter closed, and yet Agnes retained a kind of schedule. Mid-morning, she could be found on the couch, half-lidded and lounging as if she was monitoring the radiators. Performance through osmosis. Afternoon, she wandered between sunbeams like a weather report no longer required to be accurate. Evening? Her domain. From the window, she observed the softened skyline, distant cranes across the river turning like wind-blown constellations. She didn't move toward them, didn't tense or twitch. But Paul noticed she watched them a little longer than she watched anything else. Sometimes her tail flicked once. Twice. Then stillness. You thinking about it? Paul would ask once, more out of habit than expectation. Agnes never answered. But the sigh she gave as she turned away always sounded like the answer. No. Still, Paul couldn't help noticing how her gaze lingered, how she followed the steel arcs, not with longing, but remembrance. That winter, she stopped sleeping in the armchair and started stealing his pillow. He never moved her. Just turned his face into the fleece around her body, one hand brushing the fur between her ears without needing permission. She breathed slow. Even weightless, he kept her food dish full, though she ate less. Preferring small bites, widely spaced. Half a crumb here. A quiet crunch there. As if even hunger needed to be softer now. Occasionally, Paul spotted her watching him, not studying, exactly. More like confirming. Checking that he was still here, still in rhythm. Once, during a thunderstorm, the lights flickered. The air thickened, thick with ozone and half-buried memory. For the first time in weeks, Agnes stood at the edge of the windowsill, ears forward, spine straight. Paul thought she might go to the door. He even rose, just in case, but she only looked long enough for the rain to start. Then she stepped down, wound around his leg like a question mark becoming a sentence, and returned to sleep. Whatever called her before, the cranes, the steel, the bones beneath buildings, it no longer held her, yet it hadn't vanished. It was simply quieter now. Like a story that drifted between walls, waiting for new names and new ears. Paul knew that he'd seen her watching the place across town where scaffolding now rose like sprouted ribs. A building so fresh it still smelled of carved foundation. Agnes didn't move toward it, her eyes followed, yes, but her paws stayed still. She had done her work, woven it through bricks and breath, prayers and poured concrete, and now, she chose warmth over watchfulness. Sleep over sentry. She wasn't restless. She was resting. Even the radiators sighed softer when she lay near them. Even the television muted itself while she slept. Sometimes Paul read aloud from old manuals, not expecting comprehension, but comfort. Agnes would stir as though the sound mattered, and that was enough. Beyond the window, the old building stood tall. Glass gleaming clean, untouched by smudge or soot. It reflected the city back at itself like a memory polished to clarity, and inside that reflection, if you watched carefully enough, you might catch a flicker. A shape. A paw shaped like a cat, just once, then gone, but Paul didn't need flickers anymore. He had her here, still, present. The first snow was quiet, not the kind that pelts windows or buries cars. Just a hush, fine as sifted flour, floating under streetlights like stars that had given up the sky. Paul noticed it first on the balcony railing, feathering the iron edge in white lace. Inside, the radiator whispered. The lamp hummed. Agnes lay curled tightly on the armchair, no longer stretched like smoke, but compact, a comma. She hadn't moved in hours. He didn't wake her. Didn't say her name. He made tea. Let it steep longer than he meant to. Outside, the city quieted. Cranes hung still in their frames like frozen dancers mid-bow. The building across the street glowed dully, warm light pulsing behind frosted glass. Somewhere near the top, a floodlight flickered, once. Twice, then again. At 7:03. Paul glanced at the clock. The blinking colon, steady as breath. He stood. Crossed the room on bare feet. Knelt beside her. Agnes was warm, but not warming. Breathing, but not gathering breath. Her sides rose with the lightest effort. Not strained, just slow. He reached out, lightly ran a thumb from the curl of her spine to her ear. She didn't stir, but her body shifted slightly, like something inside recognized him and folded itself closer. So he sat, hand resting on fur made of wind and ash and lullabies, snow piled faintly against the windowsill. A hush slipped through the seams of the old apartment, curling around chair legs, softening corners. At some point, he didn't see when her breath stopped sinking with his, they became lighter. Less tethered. Like mist losing shape above a kettle. That night, Paul didn't light candles or say anything that could be mistaken for goodbye. He just sat still, beside her, letting the warmth of his palm keep memory from cooling too quickly. By morning, the snow was deeper, workers showed up late. Ray, paused by the fence post, now barely visible, cleared it off with his sleeve on impulse. Found nothing beneath but rust and frost. Then, as he turned to unlock the trailer, the lights inside flickered exactly at 7:03. No one mentioned it, but Gus blinked hard, sniffed once, and left 2 thermos caps by the coffee machine over on Ashford Avenue. A receptionist said the lights glitched at the exact same time, but she assumed it was the new fuse panel. Paul didn't go outside that morning. He brewed tea. Tucked the blanket closer around the now still shape in the chair. Slid a saucer beside it, not for food, but reverence, and when night fell, and the building windows glimmered like stars that had stayed behind, he stood at the open window. The air was biting, and through it, faintly, came the sound of steel groaning, bending, not in protest, but in song, like the cranes were moving for no reason. Or every reason. He didn't say her name. Couldn't. But the word lived behind his teeth, round and safe, like the hush. Between chords I and the center of the room, she rested, still curved. Still whole, the kind of stillness that doesn't end, it echoes, somewhere in the rhythm of the city. A breath was held just long enough to feel it, something finished, something freed, and still, the wind moved, still, the cranes sang. Some stories are not written down, they don't live in books or plaques or newsprint. They scatter themselves in places people forget to name. Half-understood glances. A pause in a weld. Fingers resting for a moment longer on the edge of old iron. Years passed like bricks laid in the right order. The building across from Paul's apartment survived winter in silence. It bore signs like laugh lines, scuffed thresholds, posters taped to windows for lost keys or bake sales. Kids pressing their palms against the glass to see the world upside down. The workers moved on to other sites. Agnes was spoken of less often, but with no less certainty. Did I tell you about the inspector cat? Gus would say to a new laborer, smile buried under a beard gone more snow than soot. She kept that place standing, far as I'm concerned. Some laughed. A few nodded, and once in a while, a new apprentice would hear the same story, and ask the same question all the others had. So, she's really gone? There was never one answer. Never the same tone. But there was always one pause, right where memory deepens, and then a shrug that meant belief and wonder, and something heavier, too. Paul stopped marking the days. The apartment held fewer echoes now. Some corners had gathered their own silences. But the chair remained. The tiny indent where Agnes used to curl. He never cleared it. Vacuumed around it like it still held purpose. At 7:03 each morning, the light crossed the hardwood in the same arc it always had, spilling just enough gold to sketch the shape of something remembered in another neighborhood. When demolition began on an old sawmill, a foreman told his crew, keep an eye out. Sometimes, there's a cat who watches. A teenager on his first job laughed. What, like a ghost? The man shrugged. Ghost. Spirit. Inspector. Depends who you ask. That night, as the floodlights flickered to life and shadows stretched long across the skeletal remains of timber and rust, the teen sat on a discarded beam, picking at a blister on his palm. He didn't see her at first, just felt the shift, a quiet added to the already quiet. Looked up, and there she was, gray, fur tempered by fog. Ears forward, tail wrapped. Breath rising like smoke, they locked eyes. She blinked, slow. Twice. He reached out a hand, she didn't move. Didn't flinch. He didn't call to her. Didn't speak. She sat a moment longer, then rose, stepped off the beam, and disappeared between two steel columns like a shadow conscious of its own shape. When he told the others the next morning, most chuckled. Some didn't. No tracks. No fur left behind. But the electrical cabling ordered for the site, placed in the wrong trench by mistake, was caught just in time. One of the veterans asked who noticed. The teenager said no one. Just that he felt like he should double-check. No one questioned it. In time, the story shifted again. She's not one cat, someone said at lunch. She's what's left behind. When a place gets remembered deeply enough. She's the pause before something goes wrong and the breath after it goes right. There's always a watcher. Paul heard none of this. He didn't need to. Sometimes he passed the finished building, the one she guarded from bones to glass, and nodded once, as if being saluted by something only he could see. Other times, he simply looked up at the top. Floors where lights blinked in predictable rhythm, and smiled at 7:03 without checking his watch. Inside, that armchair stayed by the radiator. He didn't sit in it, but every so often, when the sun poured just right. It looked occupied, soft enough to remember, still enough to believe. Agnes never needed a statue. She hadn't asked for her name. What she left behind was quieter than stone and stronger than steel, and long after the city changed, long after cranes bowed out of skyline hymns, someone would always pause beside a site, squint into shadow, and wonder, was that a cat? And if not, why did it feel like something had just left, only softer, like breath. Or blessing. Or love. Hidden in the corners of buildings only the stillness could see.